On the night of November 13th, 1985, one of the deadliest volcanic disasters of the 20th century unfolded in central Colombia. After decades of dormancy, the Nevado del Ruiz volcano erupted violently, triggering a massive lahar, a volcanic mudflow that buried the town of Armero under tons of debris, mud, and water. Within minutes, more than 20,000 people lost their lives. The Armero tragedy was not a simple act of nature. It was a tragedy that could have been prevented. This is the story of warnings being ignored, lives being lost, and the birthplace of one of the most powerful photographs ever taken. Colombia's Nevado del Ruiz volcano is part of the Andean volcanic belt and reaches an elevation of over 5,300 meters. Beneath the snow-covered mountain summit lies a powerful and historically active stratovolcano. Its previous eruptions, especially those in 1595 and 1845, also triggered deadly lahars that swept through surrounding valleys. But despite this dangerous history, the Nevado del Ruiz volcano had remained relatively quiet for over 100 years. In late 1984, the Colombian Geological Survey began observing renewed volcanic activity due to minor earthquakes, sulfur gas emissions, and increased fumarole activity. And by early 1985, ash was falling on the nearby towns. Scientists from Colombia and abroad issued clear warnings, and as a result, a hazard map was created in March 1985, indicating that Armero, a town of nearly 29,000 residents, lay directly in the projected destruction path of a potential lahar. Though the map was shared with local officials, it was never widely distributed to the public, as local authorities fearing panic and economic disruption downplayed the threats, justifying this as a reason not to share the destruction map with the residents. Despite this, there was resistance to the evacuation plans, and resources for emergency preparation were limited, but by October, the volcanic tremors intensified. And with these increasing alarming signs, officials reassured the public that the situation was under control. The Nevado del Ruiz volcano, which is known locally as the Sleeping Lion, remained under close observation in case anything changed, even in the slightest. But many believed that any eruption would be minor and nothing to worry about. People went on with their lives in Armero, unaware that they were living in a high-risk zone. Political indecision, economic concerns, and a lack of cohesive disaster planning all contributed towards the atmosphere of denial. And as the volcano grew more unstable, no significant evacuation efforts were undertaken, with scientists continuing to issue alerts, but they fell on deaf ears. And when the eruption came, Armero was completely unprepared. The tragedy that followed was not only a geological event, it was a failure of communication, coordination, and leadership. On November 13th, 1985, rainfall intensified around the Nevado del Ruiz summits. And as night fell, residents in nearby towns began to notice an unusual smell of sulfur in the air. Then at 9:09 p.m., the volcano erupted explosively. The eruption sent pyroclastic flows down the slopes and melted nearly 10% of the summit's glacier. The result of this was a series of massive lahars, volcanic mudflows formed by a mix of water, volcanic debris, and melted snow, with one of the lahars following the Languinila River directly towards Armero. Travelling at speeds of up to 50 kilometers an hour and reaching heights of over 10 meters, the lahar struck with devastating force, and by 11:30 p.m. it reached Armero. The town, which was located directly in the river basin, stood no chance. Entire neighbourhoods were engulfed in darkness as power lines were severed. Mud, boulders and debris swept through the streets, levelling homes, burying vehicles and crushing families as they slept. The noise was described by survivors as a thunderous roar, followed by cries for help that quickly faded into silence. In a matter of minutes, Armero ceased to exist as a functioning town. The lahar had destroyed roads and bridges, isolating the area, causing rescue efforts and operations to be delayed. Helicopters and emergency crews were unable to reach the scene until daybreak. With this, survivors clung to trees, to rooftops, and to fragments of concrete, waiting for help as the communication infrastructure was obliterated and coordination was chaotic. Aid trickled in from nearby cities, but arrived too late for many. One of the most haunting stories to emerge from the disaster was that of Omaira Sanchez. A 13-year-old girl, Omaira was trapped beneath the debris of her home. Her legs were pinned under collapsed concrete, and her lower body was being submerged in rising waters. Rescuers found her conscious and lucid, speaking calmly to journalists and relief workers. Despite their best efforts, they lacked the equipment needed to save her. Doctors on site determined that freeing her without proper tools would likely result in fatal injuries. And with this, for nearly 3 days, she remained trapped, courageous and composed. French photojournalist Frank Fournier captured her final moments in a photograph that would become globally iconic. The image of Omaira, her eyes wide, her face pale, became a symbol of human suffering and institutional failure. Omaira died on the morning of November 16th from hypothermia and gangrene. Her death shocked the world and intensified the criticism on the Colombian government's slow response. In total, over 23,000 people lost their lives, and about 5,000 more were injured, and thousands were made homeless. 85% of Armero's buildings were destroyed or buried, with only a few structures, many on the outskirts, that still remained standing. Field hospitals became overwhelmed quickly, and makeshift morgues were established as survivors were moved to refugee camps. Entire families had vanished, and many victims were never recovered, their bodies buried deep in the mud. International aid arrived within days, with the United States, France, Venezuela, and several other nations sending in medical supplies, rescue teams, and food. But for many, it was too little, too late, as the town of Armero was gone. Its streets, its schools, its churches, and its homes were now part of the vast, deadly, muddy mass grave. The scale of devastation stunned the entire world, but perhaps more disturbingly was that it could have been prevented. The Armero tragedy left Colombia in mourning and facing intense global scrutiny. The magnitude of the disaster overwhelmed the state institutions. President Belisario Betancur visited the site days later, but was met with widespread criticism. Citizens and international observers condemned the government's failure to heed warnings and coordinate an effective response. Thousands of survivors were displaced, and they were temporarily relocated to camps and nearby municipalities such as Lerida. Many lived in tents and shelters for months, and for the children who lost their families, they were placed into orphanages or taken in by distant relatives. Many survivors suffered from post-traumatic stress, grief, and survivor's guilt, as the psychological trauma was widespread. Counselling programs were eventually launched, but mental health support was limited and inconsistent. The government conducted formal investigations into the tragedy, with reports confirming that warnings had been ignored and that the hazard maps had not been circulated adequately. Disaster response protocols were also found to be outdated or even non-existent. But despite the horrific disaster, Colombia created the National System for Disaster Prevention and Response in 1989. The new policies emphasized early warning systems, public education, and better coordination between scientific and civil institutions. The Nevado del Ruiz volcano remains active and is closely monitored. Warning systems have been improved and evacuation plans are more clearly defined. However, many Colombians remain skeptical about the government's readiness. The site of Armero was never rebuilt, and it is now considered a sacred zone, a mass grave, and also a memorial. Relatives of victims visit the ruins each year to remember the loved ones that were lost. Some relatives have even erected tombstones and plaques over the sites where family homes once stood. The memory of Omaira Sanchez continues to resonate. Her image has been used in exhibitions, memorials, and educational campaigns. She is remembered not only as a victim, but as a powerful voice for those who died. The Armero tragedy is one of the deadliest volcanic disasters in modern history. Its legacy is a stark reminder of what happens when science is ignored and risk is underestimated. The event transformed Colombia's approach to disaster management, and the creation of the National System for Disaster Prevention and Response remains active today, with improved coordination between agencies and real-time monitoring of volcanic activity. Globally, the tragedy spurred greater collaborations between geologists, emergency managers, and policymakers. Armero is now a case study in disaster prevention courses all around the world. The town itself lives on in memory, and a memorial site known as Camposanto was created over the ruins. Signs and paths now mark where homes, schools, and streets once stood, and each year survivors and families return to pay tribute to those that were lost. The tragedy is remembered in schools, documentaries, and public events, with Omaira Sanchez remaining a global symbol for dignity in the face of helplessness. Her story continues to educate new generations about the human cost of inaction and the failure to prepare for a disaster. The Armero tragedy was not just a Colombian disaster, it was a human one, and the lessons learned were universal. And its victims, though buried in mud, will never, ever be forgotten.